For more on the turmoil in Iraq, we're joined by Thomas Lynch. He is a senior research fellow for South Asia and the Near East at the Institute of National Strategic Studies here in Washington, D.C. He also writes and lectures on the Middle East. Let's start with this most recent bit of news. 19 killed, 28 wounded, twin bombings in Kirkuk, suicide bombings. What do you read into this?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for having me here again. And again, I'm glad to be here on behalf of the research that I do individually at National Defense University, not representing the position of the United States government or my employers at NDU. But this is an important point, I think, now, or a point of departure in the saga of Iraq. You've now seen here a suicide bombing in Kirkuk, which has all the hallmarks of being a Shia radical suicide bombing, probably planned and implemented by the ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and done against targets in a disputed area between the Kurds and the Sunnis of Iraq. So here we have, two of the principal agents or elements in the three-way ethnic divide of the country going at each other, and yet both of them are also very frustrated with Prime Minister al-Maliki, who is the Shia head of the country. And so I think this is a bit of a indicator that we really stand at a three-way fragmentation here. And the Kurds kind of trying to stand back in the last month or so and kind of let this whole ISIS thing play out, them kind of grab some lands that they've been interested in taking from the central government of Baghdad, and then standing back from it all, that's not going to be possible. There's still enough bad blood between those two segments and sects that we are going to see this bloodletting. And now President Barzani of the Kurdistan region is going to have to make a tough decision about how much he's willing to stand back and allow these types of things happen to his own forces.
Well, it's interesting because the Kurds were here in Washington not too long ago, a delegation, and one of them described it as there's Kurdistan next to a terrorist nation, next to a failed state. Obviously, they have a lot of animosity towards Baghdad, and that's playing out as well. We're seeing that over and over again, more indications of that again today.
Absolutely. I mean, this really is a three-way engagement, much as it has been in time immemorial in Iraq, and certainly while the United States was there with military forces, up and through 2011 after invading in 2003. I think it's important to add at this point, Mike, though, as well, is that we in Washington tend to want to, brand or label parties and players here as being, bad, good, culpable or not. I think there's a lot of, concern to be leveled against all parties in this in Iraq. ISIS would not be where it is right now if it were not for the very sectarian leadership role that Maliki has played in Baghdad, putting his favored people in a lot of the Sunni regions over the last 4 to 5 years, alienating them. It wouldn't be happening if certain tribal leaders in the Sunni area didn't decide to throw their lot in with a very dangerous and xenophobic group like ISIS. And the Kurds are not clean in this either, because their military forces could have been leveraged and used much earlier on to make life difficult for ISIS, but instead, Barzani has taken the stand of, hey, not us, we're not going to help Baghdad just yet. We want more concessions from Baghdad before we do anything against ISIS.
There's also these reports coming out in the last couple of days that in the Islamic State, that region, that Christians have been targeted, that there's some massacres. This just appears to get uglier and uglier, and there's so many different facets to it. How does this thing get settled at all when John Kerry goes there as Secretary of State and says we've all got to work together? We're seeing no indications of that.
Well, you're right, Mike, and this is a key point that I and some of my colleagues have made is, the nature of ISIS as a Salafi jihadi group, and a very virulent one at that, very bloody one, is it builds up its own antibodies because it just is so highly intolerant of women, of openness, of transparency, of freedom of speech, and even the Sunnis that have sort of welcomed ISIS in as kind of an antidote to the Maliki government, I think are now finding out what their predecessors found out in the mid-2000s when they invited in al-Qaeda and its representation in Iraq, is, you can't live with these guys because they will not tolerate. They're so xenophobic, they won't tolerate you. So what does that mean? That means basically the Sunnis of the Western provinces have got to stop allowing space for ISIS to exist. They, in turn, though, would like to see some change in Baghdad. And I think that's where this has to go. There needs to be political change in Baghdad. Political change that probably is going to involve Prime Minister Maliki not being around, or being around in a very different position, because he is very toxic right now with Kurdish leaders and with Sunni leaders who have tired of the way he is led in a sectarian fashion. But that's not going to be easy, because as we've seen, Prime Minister Maliki is a survival. And he is looking right now to try to find a way to survive in this political process.
It's very interesting. Thomas Lynch, thanks so much for your observations. Always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Mike.